Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is bringing community perspectives to community solar. We have a really exciting panel of speakers today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we will tell you more about CESA and about our exciting panel in just a moment. First, I want to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar. You can call in via telephone or use a computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there, and you can also click on the arrow to expand your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. This webinar is an hour and a half total, and it will include a presentation, a moderated discussion, and then finally, in the last half hour, a Q&A with the audience. So please do submit your questions whenever you think of them, and we'll be reading them throughout the webinar, and we will have plenty of time for an audience Q&A. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email either today or tomorrow with a copy of that webinar recording, and we'll also post that information on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I will pass it over now to my colleague, CESA Executive Director Warren Leon, and he will get us started.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Folks can see up on the screen logos of the many organizations across the country, public agencies, mostly state agencies, who are members of CESA. We're a national membership organization that works with public agencies to advance renewable energy at the state level across the country. And we also do a lot of activities where we share information with wider audiences such as you folks on the line today. If we go to the next slide, you can see the list of our panelists. We're going to try to move quickly into their presentations because you have a lot of very interesting people to listen to and hear from today and talk with. And you can see them up on the screen. We have Yesenia Rivera from Energy Allies, Zara Thani from Energy Allies, Jake Ford from Solstice Initiative, Summer Sandoval from Community Solar, who's a community solar advocate, Kim Shields, Energy Outreach from Colorado, Gilbert Michaud from Loyola University in Chicago, and Daniel Chu from the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. And they've been working together to figure out the best ways to bring community perspectives to community solar. And that's what they're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to turn it over to Zara and Jake, who are going to kick things off with the presentation, and we'll leave it to them and then go to the moderated discussion that Samantha mentioned, and then to the audience Q&A. So Zara and Jake, you're on.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to start off with a big thank you to all our partners here today. Thank you to Sam for your impressive logistical organizing skills and Warren for moderating our audience Q&A. Thank you to Summer, Daniel, Gilbert, and Kim for offering your insights and expertise as our panelists. Thank you, Yesenia, for moderating our panelist discussion. And thank you, Jake, for co-presenting our research with me. Also, thank you to Yesenia. And then finally, thank you to our audience for tuning in to see how we together can make an impact in the clean energy space. So our research project, Bringing Community Perspectives to Community Solar, was made possible via grant funding from the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office, with the goal of understanding how community solar can be more accessible to low and moderate income communities. Next slide, please. Today, you'll be hearing from my colleague Jake, a data scientist based in Durham, North Carolina, uses he, him pronouns, and myself, a researcher based in Brooklyn, New York, she, her pronouns. So a little bit about Energy Allies, formerly Solstice Initiative. Our mission is to revolutionize the energy system by centering climate-impacted communities in clean energy projects, policy advocacy, and education. We're piloting community-led community solar projects in Boston, Massachusetts, and Buffalo, New York, and we're part of a number of coalitions pushing for policy change. We've also created education materials to ensure individuals have more agency when making decisions about energy. So as I mentioned earlier, our project looks into how community solar can be made more accessible. But what is community solar? So a lot of folks know about rooftop solar, and community solar is special because it doesn't have to be on a homeowner's sunny rooftop, thus making it accessible to homeowners without ideal rooftop conditions and renters. So a community solar project is an array of solar panels installed in an off-site sunny location. Individual households, whether you're a renter or homeowner, can then subscribe to a portion of the array and receive savings on their utility bill. So by design, community solar is a more accessible form of clean energy, but as of 2020, only 2% of community solar has gone to low or moderate income households. So our research looks to see why this might be the case. We have an overall objective of understanding the barriers of community solar to low to moderate income communities. We have a few questions. First, how can community solar incorporate low to moderate income and Black, Indigenous, people of color priorities into program design? And then what are developer perspectives on barriers to low to moderate income participation in community solar? Our data collection consisted of 2 surveys, focus groups, and payment performance data, but today we're just going over 2 surveys. So first we had a community-facing survey labeled as one community priority survey, in which each respondent was asked to evaluate 2 hypothetical community solar contracts with varying contract terms. Respondents also answered a number of demographic questions and general questions about trust and general questions about energy and their experience with energy. We collected data from 8 respondents in 8 states, and these 8 states were chosen because of the presence of community solar in them in 2019. We received 1,493 individual responses on this survey. So the second survey that we sent out was for developers and financiers. This element established qualitative measures of developer and financier preferences and perceived barriers to serving climate impacted communities. We received about 250 individual responses on this one. So taking a deeper look at our community solar priority survey, our main priority is to assess the favorability of a range of conventional product offerings across a range of study participants. This component of the research was set up to collect data on the changes developers and financiers might consider to better align their products with the varying communities that they might consider working in. It's meant to inform the short-term future of community solar by highlighting which immediate changes developers can make to make their products more inclusive. With the help of energy equity organizers, community solar developers and financiers, and contract law experts, we designed hypothetical community solar customer contracts that we used to test the favorability of each term, effectively assessing participant trade-offs. These contracts featured variable terms for standard components of community solar products that are thought to influence adoption, which include savings rate, or the discount a participant receives on the credits they are purchasing, term length, or how long a participant is enrolled in a community solar program, early termination fee, which is whether participants have to pay to leave a program early, and the physical length of the community solar program contract. Respondents randomly received 2 of the 24 possible contracts and were asked whether they would like to participate in either program. And as I mentioned before, we also collected a bunch of demographic information and also asked more general questions. So next, I'll pass it over to Jake to share some results from the survey.
Great, thank you, Zara. So I'll go through some of the results and also a little bit of backgrounds into the methodology of the research, because I think it's specific to the challenges we face, but I think it's also general in a couple areas that'll be interesting to share some common learnings. So first, the goal, of course, is, as Zara mentioned, is to see if we can isolate and see if there's any statistically significant contract variables that induce sign-up rates. But first, the goal is to get results that can be externally valid. So as we saw, there was 8 states that we were looking at. So to make sure, one, that we succeed in that external validity and to make sure we have a representative sample, we used survey weighting. So this is kind of the first thing, just wanted to briefly touch on. The 2 pie charts here, these are our weighted totals, and we use the American Community Surveys, the 2021 5-year And the first interesting and rather innovative technique that a previous colleague set up was in order, and a challenge that some researchers and myself have come across, is comparing income across states. So in order to kind of alleviate this issue, the solution was to use what we call dynamic income brackets. So based on a survey respondent's zip code and the number of household or number of people in the household that they self-attested, instead of seeing income ranges in dollars that are just comparable and aggregated up, the brackets themselves automatically adjusted on the back end to equal certain AMI percentages. So instead of seeing $0 to $30,000, you would see 0 to whatever that dollar amount is that equates to 30% AMI. So this makes it useful to compare Jake in North Carolina to Zara in New York, and etc. So that was a rather innovative method. It does have the slight drawback in that determining and using control totals for survey weights with this is a little bit difficult. So that's why we use race on the right here. And then just really quickly, and this is maybe something for future research, our survey did get a lot more granular in this other persons of color category, but to use the American Community Surveys, which I'm sure some of you have, this is the most disaggregate it gets, which of course is not quite as representative as we would hope, but that may be a innovative problem for someone to solve in the future. Next, just really quickly, this is just our home ownership status. So this is a 60-40 split. So this is right along that 8-state control total. So this is weighted. And then probably more interestingly and kind of alluding to our primary effect is what we're calling familiarity. So this is a binary variable, and it just asks respondents if they have ever heard of, if they are familiar in essence with community solar. So 0 being never heard of it, 1 being they have at least read about it, heard about it, have previously seen some sort of material or education. And this will be a really important result as we look into contract adoption rates, which I'm kind of alluding to here. But we put on this crosstab with income to kind of suggest and initially to look at, is this familiarity distributed along similar income bands? And you'll notice here that there's no tail effect. It's not particularly heavily aggregated along with income. It's rather, it follows something along a bell curve, which is rather interesting. So we'll talk more about familiarity when we get to the results. But just a few more pieces here. These next set of pie charts, the two on the left, this is asking respondents if either environmental benefits or financial savings are the primary motivating factor to sign up for community solar. So the savings rate is about 10% on average. It's slightly higher than environmental benefits. And then these both are higher than this bottom right pie chart, which posits if the community solar farm creates jobs in their neighborhood. Just about a little bit over half agree with that. And then last piece that we just want to put in here because we found it rather interesting, battery storage. Just about 2/3 were neutral. So battery storage is tremendously important for community solar and the expansion of it. So that was just an interesting result we wanted to put in here. We didn't really dive too much into battery storage in detail, but just flagging. And then last but not least, as a nonprofit, we were really curious about if the lead organization behind the community solar farm, if it happened to be any of these 3 entities, so a nonprofit, a utility, or the government, would there be higher degrees of trust? And it kind of follows that sliding scale. So this may suggest that nonprofits may have higher levels of nonpartisan. They're kind of disassociated with perhaps negative feelings or whatnot. And as a nonprofit, we were, of course, rather interested in that result. So just wanted to report that before we get into the actual, what we're calling the primary results. So going back to what Zara said, initially we're just looking at what are the statistically significant effects on contract sign-up rates. So this is what's called an odds ratio, and I know there's a lot of variables on this graph, and it's all smushed together. But I'll walk through it. Each of the variables, and they're grouped together along with what's called their reference category. So the effect of, and if you look at the first three of the savings rate, the top category, that 5%, is right down that red line. So that's the reference category. So the effect of the 10 and the 20% is in reference to the 5%. So that's just important as we kind of talk through what we saw was impactful in sign-up rates. And there were only a few that we can talk through, but the one that really jumps off the screen almost and off the graph is that familiarity variable. So holding everything else constant, if a participant was in that familiarity category, if they had previously heard of community solar, they were 4.4 times more likely to sign up compared to those who had not. So this suggests a lot of different conclusions, but really the main one is that education for community solar is really something that can move the needle. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but that was kind of our primary result that we were surprised at. And another thing that we were surprised at was that savings rate really didn't move the needle. And we set these fitted probabilities here at the bottom because we were most interested in, of course, of what moves the needle for the LMI population. And then to dive a bit more into the savings rate, we get a little bit more detail in this next graph. And this is a what's called a margins plot for any of you disaffected STATA users out there. This is the absolute my favorite use of that software. So this is, and for non-STATA users, this is just fitted probabilities. So just fit percentages at these different, each of these different graphs. So this is moving away from the fake contracts. So each participant got 2 contracts, different rates, and then they were asked, would you sign up? This is moving into just the general survey with a Likert scale, given these different saving rates. So 0%, 1 to 5%, how likely are you to sign up? And on the x-axis here are different income groups, and the line to focus on here is that green one. So that's the one that signifies they are likely or positively signaling that they would sign up. And the point to take here is that the high income group is always higher than the moderate and is always higher than the low across each saving rate offered to the participants. So this suggests that to increase low and moderate income participation in community solar, it'll take something more than just savings rates to get them included. So this of course suggests a number of conclusions for designing proper and inclusive contracts, and that was a really a strong result that we found from this kind of secondary analysis, moving away from those mock contracts. So that's it in a nutshell. I'll pass it back over to Zara to go through the developer and financier survey.
Thanks, Jake. So switching to our developer and financier survey, when asked why developers have difficulties in including low to moderate income communities in their projects, customer acquisition costs were ranked as the most important factor. and the only one to be above 50% in terms of importance amongst other factors such as risk of churn and default, lack of project financing, difficulty qualifying households as low income, and difficulty communicating community solar. So to clarify, customer acquisition cost is the cost associated with finding low to moderate income participants for a given solar project. So this shows that maybe additional resources such as partnerships with community-based organizations could be useful in ensuring the benefits of clean energy reach low-income communities. And we'll talk more about customer acquisition costs during our panel discussion. And then next, when asked what motivates developers to include low to moderate income communities, policy requirements were identified as very or extremely important amongst 63% of our respondents. So thus, policy requirements were the most important amongst other factors such as company interest, financier interest, equity and inclusion, and community interest. So this really illustrates how important organizations pushing for policy changes are, and how new legislation, which mandates a certain percentage or a certain percentage thresholds for low-income participation, will be critical in ensuring that community solar is more accessible. So to conclude and go back to some of our objectives, how can community solar incorporate LMI and BIPOC priorities into program design? First, communities should be involved in program design. This is really a lesson in process, and working with community-based organizations will ensure that there is a lot more participation when communities are asked what they want to see in clean energy projects. Next, we need to increase the amount of education that occurs about community solar. We saw a really, really strong correlation with familiarity and sign-up rate, as Jake talked about. And so there needs to be information sharing that is built into program design. Energy Allies is actually developing curriculum around energy justice, which includes breaking down the technical jargon heavy side of community solar into more accessible language, and developers should work on also involving education in their program design. Next is that savings rate is not sufficient for LMI participation. Projects need to be more innovative. Although savings are arguably important, it's not enough, and community input needs to happen a lot earlier. Finally, looking back at our developer survey objective, what are developer perspectives on barriers to LMI participation in community solar? We need to look towards solutions that decrease customer acquisition cost. Whether these come in the form of policy or technology, they're critical to ensuring developers include more LMI folks on their projects. And then finally, policy work is really critical. It's really important to ensure that developers include LMI folks on their projects. And additionally, as a result of this research, Energy Allies is looking to move more into the policy space. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Yesenia to moderate a discussion on these findings and the future of community solar with our awesome panelists.
Yesenia, you are muted.
I am muted.
There you
yes.
go. You're good.
I got it. My bad. Thank you to Sarah and Jake for sharing the amazing research. We have a great panel for you today, and I'm going to try to get through all the questions that we have for our panelists. And I did see that somebody was asking for the definition of AMI, that is area median income, and it's defined by the federal government. Basically, it's what the federal government uses to determine whether or not you're low to moderate income. 80% of the area median income or lower, it's considered low to moderate income. In several states and other programs are using it as a way to define who qualifies as a low to moderate income family. So I'm going to start with a question for all of our panelists. Given the survey results, what do you think are the biggest challenges to LMI participations in community solar? Additionally, are these challenges aligned with or different from the perceived normative challenges to LMI participation from either public or solar developers?
I can kick us off. I think that from our experience here in Colorado, and the survey sort of reflected this, I think that one of the biggest challenges is still trust. We saw the pie charts there, and I would venture to guess that if solar developers were included there, that they might perform the worst out of everybody. They're often unknown to the community. coming in with no history or relationship, right? So with nonprofits performing the best on that trust piece, I encourage solar developers to work with local organizations, and that can be a great connection point to the community. And I think that differs from some of the public or developer perceived challenges, which tend to be focused on high risk in serving the LMI population and high cost. And I think that both of those can be addressed with new creative solutions. And we can focus on instead reducing barriers to access and developing that trust.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick and say that what I would have hypothesized to come out of this survey is what I've been hearing over the years when I've been studying community solar and talking to sort of folks on the ground. Again, I'm a professor, and so I'm doing a lot more research, higher level stuff, but engagements that I have with utilities, with NGOs, with local government folks, the finding and educating subscribers piece is like incredibly important. Like, I'd be curious what the other panelists are seeing on a day-to-day basis in terms of, I'm a developer, and I'm assuming we're going to talk a little bit more about engagement. Engagement is really important. Where are we going to build these projects? Do we have the demand for these projects? I've been doing a lot of work with developers that are doing surveys and trying to understand where to site projects, if there's an appetite for projects in specific communities. And then that education piece, and this always comes up in these things, but how do we make sure that folks, especially LMI folks, historically marginalized communities, populations, neighborhoods, like, know that they have opportunities to participate in solar energy through community solar. That's like what the underpinning of community solar is at large, right? And so doing that engagement education on sort of both ends is incredibly important.
I'll jump in here, and then again, thank you for those wonderful presentation of the survey results. And just going off the conversation about trust, I think that one of the major challenges has to be expectations. And I know we're going to talk about policy and requirements later on in this Q&A, but really setting the stage for what are the developer expectations when it comes to engaging and working with communities, because right now we're seeing still a lot of top-down project development from solar developers that treat customer or subscriber acquisition as a checklist item as part of their business model, instead of seeing and truly treating communities as project partners that need to be integral parts of solar projects from start to finish.
Yeah, tagging onto what Summer already said, I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot in terms of doing work in New York, throughout New York State, is that community awareness really helps interest in community solar, but that interest is not enough in helping to get a project started and going through the projects. A lot of the challenges come in the initial costs of pre-development funding costs and capital investment costs over kind of the savings. Something that communities, especially the low-income communities that we serve, really have to kind of focus on and think about when they want to start a project. And the one way that they can think about it better is how they can have equity in these projects and receive long-term benefits. So over the course of 10, 20, 30 years, communities can actually see more benefits than just subscriber savings. You can see funding being provided to communities on doing other projects other than solar. And another thing that we're seeing as a huge challenge is thinking about in terms of policy barriers. So a lot of my community solar projects are often on the smaller or slightly small scale, and that has issued receiving funding from both state entities, state-owned banks, green banks, et cetera, and having those policy barriers being dropped and not being disadvantaged towards LMI communities, which are already disadvantaged, and can be a really encouraging way to encourage more people, especially in our communities, to sign up for solar.
Thank you for that. Kim, I would like to circle back to you. Can you share a bit of what EOC is doing in increasing LMI participation in community solar?
Sure, yeah. So, another challenge we've seen is also the billing structure that comes with typical community solar subscriptions. Here in Colorado, we don't have consolidated billing, so that means an additional bill for your subscription charge, and then the credits showing up on your utility bill. And so something we're working on is reducing that, or eliminating that second bill, I should say. So our programs, we have a variety of energy programs available to LMI customers, the most popular being our utility bill assistance program. And while this is available to anyone up to 80% of the area median income, we find our average household participating earns just 22% of the area median income. So these are families really struggling to pay their bills and becoming behind and at risk of being disconnected. Some already have been disconnected by their utilities. So we want these households to also be able to participate in renewable energy programs and in community solar. And it's not realistic to expect them to take on the burden of paying another subscription bill. The household may not be banked or able to access online billing platforms that we see with a lot of solar subscriptions. So we're looking for creative ways to just eliminate that bill entirely. We've done that through advocacy work at utility stakeholder groups and at the Utilities Commission to provide higher incentives to solar developers if they're able to offer some of those subscriptions at no cost. We've also leveraged grant funding and private donations to help purchase subscriptions on behalf of households so that they can just receive the bill credits and not be burdened with that subscription charge at all. So we think this is an exciting and innovative way to help those most extremely low income and vulnerable households who are often paying into these programs through their bills to be able to participate in community solar as well.
Thank you. Summer, can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between customer acquisition costs and interconnection? And specifically, what is it that we need to do to solve the interconnection challenges?
No, thank you for this question. I think it's really important to lift these early pre-development questions up, especially because they're a lot of times the less sexy questions and challenges that come up when we're talking about solar development, right? Everyone's really excited about the ribbon cutting and seeing bill savings, and there's a lot of really difficult systemic barriers that need to be overcome before we even get there. And two of those big buckets are customer acquisition, which is, engaging with community, sharing your story about, what is your project, and getting people signed up to be actual energy off-takers to a project, as well as interconnection costs, right? The costs associated with getting your solar project connected to the electrical grid. So I'll start with customer acquisition. I think that what I was touching on in the first answer is also really relevant in that it is often just trying to be sped through by developers. And this is kind of like the first and foremost most important part of a project and our biggest opportunity to invest in a community. Community engagement and building community capacity to be able to participate meaningfully as decision makers and stakeholders in a solar project is so important. And I will also just note that there's still a very big disparity and disconnect when we kind of lump in together low and moderate income, and that there's still, if we're talking about the most vulnerable of frontline communities, that we have to look at the priorities and concerns of low income communities, and that includes low-income homeowners, that includes low-income renters, people on public assistance, and that narrative is really important in building that trust. And that's kind of a big part in terms of how do we answer the question of how do we use solar as a just transition, and that means we have to be talking about systemic changes. And a big part of that is redressing past harms, and where the rubber meets the road is engaging and building with communities to make sure that a solar project is actually supporting and addressing local needs and challenges such as gentrification.
Thank you. This is for any of the panelists, it feels like answering. The developer survey illustrated that developers are motivated to make changes as a result of policy requirements. What policy changes would make community solar more accessible?
I'll jump in first as the policy professor on the panel, I suppose. I think it was interesting. I would have hypothesized the survey results in terms of developers care about policy, right? And states that have LMI stipulations, that's just sort of a requirement for operating in that state. Some states don't have that stipulation. And a few things that I think about in terms of policy changes, and this is really interesting in this very federalist system that we have, like every state has different policies and it's not very uniform across states, which is perhaps a challenge, maybe an opportunity. I think of caps as one thing of potential interest. So some states have 500 megawatts or 1 gigawatt sort of project or program cap on community solar. Some states are uncapped. And so lifting caps in some states are allowing larger amounts of community solar in terms of installed capacity to be deployed is one thing. And then some states have like project size caps as well. That might be 1 or 2 megawatts. Some states go up to 10 or 20 megawatts. And so increasing the amount of a project, a community solar project that can be built would also be an effective policy change in some states. Bigger projects, economies of scale, cheaper to build, those savings can be passed on to consumers and subscribers. So that's a potential policy change of interest. The LMI stipulation piece is interesting. There's 15, 20 states that have enabling legislation for community solar. About half of them have some sort of LMI provision, right? And they're different across states themselves. But increasing those percentages from 30 to 40% to something higher, perhaps, to make sure that we're actually grabbing those LMI folks. This was a lesson that was learned in Minnesota, which is a sort of exemplary community solar state. But when the program first started, a lot of the subscribers were actually commercial and industrial folks that saw this as a good investment. And only maybe 10%, don't quote me on that, but I think about 10% of the folks were actually residential folks. And I don't know how much of that were LMI folks. And so, were we actually achieving the objective of targeting homeowners who couldn't do solar because of shading, lower income, et cetera? Well, maybe not. And so you have to go back and revise policy, right? And then to Kim's point about the subscriber compensation would be the last thing that comes to mind. How can we make that more uniform? How can we make it enticing for subscribers, full retail rate, value of solar? These debates are going on in a lot of states right now, so.
I'll piggyback off that to say that the devil's in the details, right, with these policy requirements. So we've seen in Colorado, the same thing. There might be a carve out to serve low income, but without any details or requirements about what that looks like, then subscription acquisition will follow the path of least resistance. And here that meant going to affordable housing providers, right, which counted as low income subscribers, but that meant we weren't reaching the residential households that could benefit from these savings. So I'd like to see us evolve from just carve outs to stronger policy requirements around what the savings rate are, how we're equitably reaching the different customer classes and rate classes, and then policies that help us reach all the demographics as well and reducing all the barriers to accessing.
Tagging onto what they both said, one of the things that New York has is an LMI stipulation, but one of the things that we're not seeing uniformly across the country is on whether or not these 35 to 40% are done as benefits or done as investments. In New York, we try to push for these to be investments in communities, and the investments are actually going through to local residents in these communities. So these investments really should be held accountable in terms of the way they're deployed, and either as a value of a kilowatt hour generated or as a value of the different kind of capital gains that local LMI communities can have from these processes. So making sure that in a policy level, these investments are truly flowing and being held accountable in these communities is something that we're really focused on and think about here.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll also just add on that, kind of going from state level to local, that on a state level, I think it's really important to have community solar incentives and mandates. We're not seeing that across all 50 states. Even today, when this already more national reckoning that we need to have this clean energy transition and we need to be centering equity in this. And then on a more local level, also more could be also state or municipality level that there's been mention of carve outs, and there needs to be details about that. There needs to be, it can't just be incentivizing developers to build projects where it's easy to build projects. We need to assign value to developing projects that are centered in equity, which means incentivizing community ownership, incentivizing shared ownership, incentivizing projects that are built with and in environmental justice communities. It's incentivizing projects that offer co-benefits such as workforce training, local hiring, apprenticeship programs, all of these other benefits and investments that come with solar that is really showing and modeling how solar can be used, and not just putting panels on a rooftop, but how to build community capacity and how to really center equity and clean energy development. And then I realized I didn't answer the second part of the last question, which is really integral, which is creating and streamlining an interconnection community fund that will economically support community-owned community solar projects with the interconnection costs, and that those costs should not be on the community owners of a solar project, especially if are the same communities that have had fossil fuel burning and generating plants and other extraction located in or near their communities.
Thank you.
One other thing, if you don't mind me jumping back in.
I was just going to go back to you, Gilbert. If you had any examples, and I'm hoping that's what you were going to talk of, projects that have enabled legislation.
Yeah, a couple things. One thing real quick on sort of the policy LMI piece, I think a lesson learned of community solar legislation is that some states had a carve out, right, 30, 40% at sort of the aggregate level. And what we've seen is that you can check those boxes with a smaller number of projects, but having those carve outs at the project level instead of at the state level is like a really important thing to make sure every single project has 30 or 40 or whatever the percentage is of LMI folks that are subscribing is like incredibly important, right? And I think that when New Mexico was drafting their legislation a couple of years ago, that was like a very pointed topic of discussion to make sure that every single project that we build in the state, whether it's urban, rural, et cetera, actually achieves those targets, not just a small number of projects, but some projects maybe aren't touching on LMI folks at all, right? At any rate, to get to your question, so I've done a lot of work on community solar policy adoption at the state level. What are the drivers, barriers, opportunities in terms of states that are actually passing enabling legislation? That was like the very specific topic of my PhD dissertation work and other work that I've been doing as a faculty member. One of the things that I've seen is usually legislation doesn't sort of happen overnight, right? It doesn't go from 0 to 100. We passed a bill, now we have it, we can build community solar. It's usually this much more nuanced and over time process where NGOs and local governments are trying to figure out, maybe loophole is not the right term, but sort of programs, crowdfunding, can we do something community-based, community-led solar that still touches on some of these types of objectives that we're looking for, solarized programs, bulk purchasing, other ways that we can engage and have folks in communities building local solar projects. And then you have this education and awareness process that happens and sort of bubbles up to the state level. Hey, look at all the environmental and economic benefits we're seeing locally. Maybe if we actually pass legislation, we'd see a ton more of these projects. And so usually it's a process that goes as such. I think a lot of innovation has been happening out of electric co-ops, which is really interesting as part of this discussion. A lot of rural co-ops that are sort of more democratic in nature and engage with their member owners have responded to member demand over years and built projects. Bark Electric Co-op, where I went to school in Virginia, was an interesting example of that. They built 2 phases of their community solar projects and had a lot of demand for those. And so we've seen a lot of local governments, community choice aggregation entities, CCAs, which are available in some states, and I think co-ops that are designing programs, and again, how that's sort of bubbling up and say, hey, maybe we could deploy this at larger scale through state legislation.
Thank you. So we are almost halfway through our time for this panel, but just to let you all know, we're used to the commercially developed community solar project with for-profit developers taking the lead. I think as we are growing this push for a just transition and energy justice and energy democracy come to the forefront of the conversations, we're seeing this increase in the need for community-led development of community solar, where the community is actually involved in the decision making. What is the relationship you think we're going to have moving forward between that commercial community solar development and community-led options?
I can jump in and start with, I think that we're at a fork in the road, and that when I say that, I mean a lot of states are passing new clean energy legislations. We're seeing large investments, not only on the state level, but federal level as well, into clean energy. And so there's a lot of essential conversations and decision making that's happening in terms of where that money is going, how that money will get spent, and how to ensure that frontline communities will get those investments and see those investments. So I think that if we continue with a more business as usual model, there's a huge threat that we're going to continue to see big oil and gas companies become big clean energy companies. And what that means is that there's still going to be a continued top-down decision-making, a top-down, profit-driven clean energy economy where we have this opportunity to change the rules. And changing the rules would mean that there are project requirements to receive solar incentives that require shared ownership, that require higher savings, that require community engagement to not be treated like a checklist item, but an important part of project development. And this will ensure that not only benefits, but direct investment dollars will go into communities, and not just during the project development timeline, but during the whole lifetime, 25 to 30 years of the project that is consistently creating and producing local community wealth for historically marginalized communities.
Tagging up the summer, in New York, we're already seeing a lot of fossil fuel companies trying to transform themselves into clean energy companies. And, we're not necessarily opposed to those things if they can, shut down a lot of the generation facilities that they have in New York State. If they're already polluting local communities, if they're able to transition those out, certainly that is a good thing. But one of the things that we do want to prioritize is that there must be a wealth building pipeline for local communities that are energy burdened, that has been impacted by the generation produced by fossil fuel for, decades. To think about how they can receive more benefits than other communities, or not be disadvantaged in the process of this transitioning. So one of the reasons why NYCJA, which is the acronym for New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, is so focused on working on community-led solar over kind of promoting every other kind of solar, is that we really think community-led solar and community-owned solar specifically actually has a lot of potential in building this careers pipeline, so that local communities are deeply engaged with their energy systems, that they can have true energy democracy, and that this is not something that just comes in and somebody builds it and leaves it alone. That this is something that community can have ownership and engagement over, and have decision making over how they want to control that's something that they own, and how they want to maintain this going forward, and how they can expand it from their communities to other communities that they're aligned with. So this is something that we're really focused on building a long-term infrastructure, so that every community can think about how they can own their energy infrastructure and how they can benefit from it as well.
Yeah, I likewise am sort of a proponent personally of diversity of deployment type, right? And so some folks have opportunities to purchase shares and get involved in community solar through their large investor-owned utility, and that serves a lot of folks, especially in urban areas, depending on where you live in your service territory. But to me, true community solar is a church or a school or a neighborhood of folks can band together, design a special purpose entity, build a project locally, and have a specific neighborhood or a school or a group of folks that actually go through the legal and financial considerations and have this engagement and figure out what community solar looks like to them. And to me, that's sort of more true community solar, if you will, and really important as we talk about the role of engagement in communities and involvement.
Thank you. Kim, unless you want to answer, move on.
I think everybody touched on it. I think that, to make that successful, we should listen to what Summer mentioned earlier about really putting value to a lot of the non-energy benefits of this community-led solar, so that they have a space to develop and lead the way. I also think with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's adders that can be achieved for building projects in energy communities, they obviously have to be at the table for those conversations, and right up there with the developers, and making sure that that project is what's best for the community and where it's sited, and that the benefits flow to those local residents as well.
Thank you. So the research looked at changes that developers could make to program offerings. What processes should community solar developers put in place to ensure that their projects align with community needs?
I think For each community, their process will definitely vary, but one of the things developers can do as a kind of principle is to make sure that they are able to communicate kind of what they want and what they can provide very upfront and very transparently to each community they're working with, so that once a community is thinking about doing a project with a developer, they can think about what the benefits that they can get, what kind of payment they have to kind of come up with, or what kind of sacrifice they have to come up with upfront to have long-term wealth and long-term equity in each project. So something that is not necessarily like equally applied in every community, but some communities might want more equity, some communities might want more savings upfront. This is something that will definitely vary, but making sure that developers can communicate this upfront and showing communities and educating the communities on how each of this process can play out in a long term is really important.
Yeah, and I think the partnerships are going to be really key for this. So like Daniel said, every community is going to be different. And so rather than developers trying to start from scratch and relearn every community and their preferred lesson, like means of communication, I think that's great, but they'll need to rely on partnerships with local organizations that I think already know and understand their community and have that level of trust, and that can really launch the project, to the next level of success, I think, to reaching its residents and making sure everyone is aware of the benefits and well educated on the benefits. Something Gilbert mentioned in the beginning, that I think we can always do better on the education and outreach. So using those local partnerships will be helpful.
And I'm going to tie this back with the beginning conversation around trust, and that solar developers also need to be able to meet people where they're at. And as we can see, that's not happening, or not happening very well, or at a large enough scale right now. And that's why, there's a need for, when we say like all hands on deck moment, we need organizers and educators and graphic designers, and all these different roles to help build, something that we haven't seen before, and that there can't be this continued trying to, just translate something from one language to another. There's also engagement work that needs to be done to make sure the actual content is accessible. Are we utilizing, sentences? And, we're going down to the very granular level of like, to subscribe a contract, energy is scary, and it's scary for a lot of people. And I think that is often lost in this romanticized lens of clean energy, and that's still for a lot of people, energy is really scary. And so how can we really use that as being, how can we use that to make sure we're meeting people where they're at? And that's a really big challenge for developers, to be able to meet communities where they're at.
For me, real quick, what everyone else already said, I suppose, to Kim's point about partnerships, some of the better community solar projects I've seen, even if a developer is not in a specific city or maybe out of state altogether, is those partnerships, right? Partnering with a local nonprofit, even if they don't do clean energy stuff in particular, but maybe they do something around cooperatives, or they do something around environmental justice or reducing emissions, like those local partnerships, and then the ability to engage with folks through those types of NGOs and other agencies and such is really important. And yeah, back to the engagement piece, right? I do a lot of work on utility scale projects too, community solar projects. How do we make sure that we're actually talking to the communities and responding to what they want? The worst thing is if you build a project and no one sort of comes to it, right? No one subscribes to it. And so I've worked with a lot of co-ops and NGOs that have actually also designed surveys like you all did for this project, and trying to solicit that feedback in terms of what a community wants to see. It's a really important and simple strategy.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, but real quick, Daniel, can you talk about any of New York EGA's project that actually align those community needs?
Yeah, so New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is a partner in the Revitalize Partnership, which was formed in 2015 in response to the Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV, plan by then Governor Cuomo and the Public Service Commission. So what Revitalize wants to do is really to fight for key recommendations in prioritizing the 35% or more clean energy investments for disadvantaged communities. And what we've since 2015 done a lot of projects and made a lot of progress towards building community-owned solar in the Buffalo, in New York, in Bronx, and in Brooklyn. And all these projects, they range from I think 600 kilowatts in the smallest scale to about 1 megawatt at the largest scale, and those are all either half owned or entirely owned by community organizations on the ground. So they host town halls, and we do organization efforts to make sure that each community can have input on what they want out of the project. I think one of the most exciting ones is the one that Uprose is doing, which is one of the NYCHA members and the Revitalize partner doing in Sunset Park, which I think is a 600 plus kilowatt project based on a New York City Economic Development Corporation owned land, which is going to be a really exciting project that kind of thinks about how communities can have ownership and control over a community solar project at the same time, kind of being an unprecedented effort and working with public entities and semi-public entities like the Economic Development Corporation, and thinking about how they can lower their policy barriers and they can lower their kind of regulatory barriers to kind of help facilitate building more community solar in different communities throughout New York City. And that's just one of the many projects that are in our pipeline to come. So hopefully we can kind of share those lessons learned as a partnership and kind of replicate it and make it scalable throughout New York State, if not in other places.
Thank you. With the couple of minutes we have left, this again for all the panelists, any additional remarks on how we can ensure an equitable clean energy transition?
I guess I can jump in first. This is the quintessential $1 million question, right? I think energy democracy is a big theme in terms of academic research. This is what a lot of my colleagues are writing about. Again, we've already touched on this, like ways to do engagement and make sure that communities actually have a say in this energy transition and what it looks like and means for them, I think is really important. One of the interesting things that I pulled out of the survey was a lot of folks are recognizing the environmental benefits of projects and deploying more clean energy. And it was kind of interesting, maybe perplexing even, how less folks, and still a lot, but like less folks relative to the other variables were convinced about the economic benefits of projects. And this is like, frankly, like a huge sell, especially in maybe less progressive states or like laggard policy states where folks might not be as sure about what this looks like, but when you pitch them on, hey, there's going to be thousands of construction jobs, there's going to be tax dollars that are fed into communities. This is like a very pointed area of my expertise and interest, where I do a lot of these economic impact studies. And I think that's a really important piece of this too. We're reducing emissions, we're seeing a lot of other benefits, including the economic piece. And on that note, I also have done a lot of work, and Daniel touched on this, on communities that have been like burdened by pollution or a coal mine or a coal-fired power plant closing, and making sure that we're not just building these community solar projects in urban and suburban areas, but also rural areas, places that have been burdened from fossil fuel generation assets, making sure that we're offering opportunities to those types of communities and those populations as well, I think is like incredibly important.
Yeah, I think I'll just sum up things we all touched on throughout, which is that if we're going to achieve true equity, by definition, there's no one size fits all approach, right? So we need all creative solutions for financing and development. We need all outreach strategies that we can employ, diverse partnerships. It's really just going to take everything we have to meet every community where they're at, and really every household, understanding their challenges and barriers. So.
Daniel and I are playing closer chicken, but I'll go. I'm going to answer with fund it. If you want to see community ownership, investors out there, fund it. If you want to see community-led projects in frontline communities, we need states and cities to fund it. And that all of these things that we've been talking about this whole conversation, this is so incredibly hard, and there's so many unforeseen and foreseen challenges, and to be able to center equity, because like we said, we've gotten pretty good at putting panels on rooftops, but that's not what we're doing here. You know, we're building a just transition, and that's going to take building something new. And whenever you build something new, there needs to be an investment. So we need to fund it. We need to fund community ownership and fund community-led projects.
Yeah, all of the above, but I think one thing that we haven't touched on enough, perhaps throughout this conversation, given that it's so short, but one thing that's incredibly important that community solar can actually do for folks, especially in disadvantaged communities, is the public health impacts that it has. And the public health benefits that it can provide. A lot of communities that we serve has long-term asthma. Almost entire population there has asthma, and they're one of the poorest populations in the country, if not in the world. I think the Bronx is one of the poorest constituencies in the entire United States, aggregately. So thinking about kind of like they're already suffering so much economic disadvantage, how can you provide things that can not just build long-term wealth, but also provide public health benefits to these communities so that they can no longer suffer from kind of the long-term impacts that they have from asthma, from other kind of respiratory diseases, which in turn decrease their cognitive functions or kind of impact their ability to thrive in long term and in the future, and especially for their children. You know, kind of thinking about the public health benefits and connections, so that with community solar is something that, you know, in the long term can truly make equity a really engaging conversation when you talk about it with different communities.
Thank you to our wonderful panel. I'm going to hand it back over to Warren and the CISA team, because we have a lot of audience questions apparently.
Yeah, we do have a lot of audience questions, and I will be asking them. Some are for the panelists, some are for the researchers, having to do with the study, and I'll ask a range of different types of questions. A couple having to do with the survey itself. One was, did the topic of consumer protection come up at all as a factor in terms of the attractiveness of community solar?
That wasn't included in our initial survey. So we didn't ask any questions about consumer protection.
And how about in terms of the results you got about people's attitudes towards utilities? Is there any way to determine whether there was a distinction as to whether it was a rural electric co-op or a municipal utility as opposed to an investor-owned utility?
We didn't specify the type of utility, so no. Okay.
And this is a broader question for anybody here, having to do with the tension between the physical distance between the solar project and the recipients of the energy. You know, on the one hand, if you allow a further distance to the project, it's maybe possible to get greater economies of scale, but does that reduce some of the other perceived benefits, such as workforce training or jobs or other truly local benefits? And does it just make it less appealing for a low-income resident to participate because it's not something they associate with their community? Do you have any thoughts about how to deal with that tension? And anybody should just jump in. I mean, I know there's a lot of folks on the panel, and so you'll just have to choose to jump in and take the question.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I can speak too much about attention, given that the projects that NEJA focuses on really tries to help are projects that are based in the community, so you can actually kind of just walk along the side of the street, kind of go onto the rooftop if you have access and safely, to kind of see these projects happening in your own neighborhood, and kind of making sure that there's a pipeline of development that are going to your neighborhood that are hiring local workers. So, you know, making sure that you can connect these as local as possible, that will make it easier, I think, for other kind of solar subscriptions to come up, and that people are less removed from an everyday kind of solar projects that are perhaps more larger scale, but are based outside of their local municipality. But if you have something that's already based locally that people can see and people can feel the impacts of, they're more likely, I think, easier to subscribe to a larger kind of utility scale solar project.
Yeah, I think I'll add that in Colorado, I think it's a balance, like you said, with that tension that we've seen some customers who really care about the solar being in their community, and they do feel more tied to it and want to subscribe and stay involved. However, we know that there's a lot of severely energy burdened customers who live in areas where community solar will never be built. Some really tough terrain or lack of interconnection. So the ability for them to subscribe to a community solar array that might be hundreds of miles away, I think, is a really neat benefit of community solar as well. So we just want to make sure it's accessible to everyone and not too restrictive.
For us at Energy Allies, because we're focused on community-led community solar, it's important that it be localized and be sited in the community, and that the community has an active voice in deciding where these projects will be built. I think that for us is it overweighs the benefits of trying to maybe build a larger project somewhere else and then convince folks of signing up. I think if, like Daniel said, if they can see it, if they know that it's having an impact in their community, it's bringing in jobs, it's bringing in infrastructure that is needed around that community, that outweighs the benefits of maybe building a cheaper project somewhere else.
And how about in terms of the issue of bill savings versus ownership? Does anybody have any evidence that consumers are really more attracted to a project that will give them a sense of ownership of the solar array, either in the short run or the long run, as opposed to a project that's just giving them bill savings?
I'll jump in and say that this is one of those questions where you have to meet communities where they're at, and you can't expect communities to have, I guess, like an answer to that without that like building of capacity. And that there is, I will say, a more general fear of what liability looks like. And so I think that that's kind of the key of building a narrative around community ownership. And there needs to be community protection when it comes with ownership. And there needs to be significant investment and not only engaging communities of what is, community-led solar project, but how will you, participate? What are the options? What does it mean to be a stakeholder? And that these things aren't intrinsic. They don't just happen. You can't just show up in a community and say, hey, do you want a community-owned solar project? And that these projects, they take years of investment and organizing and work to get to the point where a community can come together, build a project, learn from each other, and share important learnings of this is what we know, this is what we want to still learn. And it's a very beautifully collaborative and an iterative process as well, because we're building something, that you haven't seen before necessarily. And so there's a lot of investment and resources needed to be able to increase the community's capacity to participate and own a project, and that doesn't just happen when a developer shows up, and that happens through true partnership.
And to piggyback off that, they're also from a research perspective, Warren, you asked what was the evidence, and this kind of gets to that there just needs to be additional research in this area to what actually moves the needle. So in our initial steps, we were looking for other literature review resources to kind of base what has been out there in the field, and there's a relative dearth of research in community solar and kind of the stickiness of what works. So there needs to be a lot more investment into the research side.
Okay, go on.
Just to add a little bit more, I totally agree with Summer and Jake, and we also conducted focus groups in different states, and we saw communities asking for really different things depending on the community. So some people wanted to see additional savings, other people wanted that money to be reinvested in the form of education in the community, and so it really varies. It's not a question of savings or ownership, it's dependent on that individual community, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution.
Well, I was just going to say real quick, if I may, Warren, I apologize, that like communities want to know where their dollars are going, right? There is some aspect of what's in it for me, whether it's bill savings or something else. One quick anecdote, which was really interesting, in Athens, Ohio, where I used to work, they sort of built this and designed this community-based solar program, which was a little bit different, but they were sort of asking folks to invest in city-led sort of community-based solar on City Hall and parking garages and libraries, and pay a little bit more actually. And the folks were like, well, what's in it for us? And it was like, we can realize the economic and environmental benefits in our community by building local solar projects. And the city's going to be saving money, and they're going to fix potholes around the city. And people were like, oh, cool, this is really interesting. And that was what moved the needle for that community, among a couple other things. So it's highly circumstantial, as others have noted.
How about, are there other models that any of you could point to that can be applied to community solar? One of the folks writing in said, hey, community solar projects aren't the only types of energy projects out there. Is there anything we could learn from other sorts of energy projects or energy efficiency efforts that can be applied to solar that benefits communities and especially low-income communities? Well, nothing immediately comes to mind. You know, that's one we could get folks in the audience to be thinking about as well, but it is an interesting thing to consider whether there are other applicable models that can be applied to this sphere. A narrower question, it came up the topic of consolidated billing, that there are advantages to consolidated billing. Do we have any evidence that that really moves folks? Either it makes it more appealing for somebody to sign up, or it makes it more appealing for developers because they think they're less likely to experience bill payment defaults?
Yeah, maybe Jake and Zara has more empirical evidence, but speaking from like a qualitative perspective, definitely if you have consolidated billing, it makes it a lot easier to convince folks that you're going to have bill savings on your energy bill, and you can actually see it, kind of see it directly in the monthly bills that you already see, and that there's less paperwork and a lot of less administrative processes that each folks need to go through to kind of subscribe for Communityled, which you know, it may only take 3 minutes out of the day, but they would consider a huge kind of roadblock in comparison to just seeing a bill reduction on their monthly bill. So, you know, consolidated billing, I think, can definitely really help folks be more convinced that community solar is something that's worth subscribing to.
And going off of that, I would also say that consolidated billing is also a lot better for community-owned projects, in that usually when there is a two-bill system, there has to be annual money spent on that second platform, you know, in terms of making sure that that bill and all of that information is being stored and used. And so when there is consolidated like public billing, then that is a line item that can go opens up funds, project funds that can go directly into a community fund that can go into increased savings. Is basically freeing up additional cash flows into a project that can go back into the project, can stay in the project, which is all part of seeing how to maximize the amount of money that's staying within a project, and that is being able to be used for community wealth building, albeit savings, funds, mutual aid, and other creative ways.
You know, and one thing, Summer, you referred to earlier was the long development timeline for a community solar project. And we also know that there are long interconnection queues and delays for projects to get online. I guess I have a two-part question. How big of an issue is that in terms of getting folks interested in being involved in a community solar project if they know the timeline is going to be long? And at what point in the development process, if it's a commercial process, not starting in the community, but starting from a solar development company, should they actually start trying to get folks interested in the project? Or do they run the risk if they start too soon, people will, you know, sort of feel like it's a bait and switch. They've gotten interested in something, but they're not going to see the results for 3 or 4 years.
No, I think that's a really big issue, and I think it's really harmful to trust building, in that a lot of interconnection processes are not only really long, but really expensive. And so to come in with a vision of a project in terms of what the financing model, what all of everything is going to look like, and basically trying to shield it from all of the external challenges, especially from interconnection, is really a really big threat to a project, especially when it comes to building trust with subscribers, where you're trying to be conservative with like, okay, this is when these milestones will be hit. And sometimes you see delays in projects for, 2+ years. And that's really harmful when it comes to trying to build trust in the community. Please be involved in this. And, this is going to be a really amazing project when you said something's going to start at a certain year and, it might be several months or several years off. And that's not even talking about the additional costs that may make or break a project as well.
Yeah, I'll just add that this is a huge challenge for us at Energy Outreach Colorado, especially since we're trying to serve the most extremely low-income households and enable them to participate in community solar. The bill savings that they're looking to realize can really make the difference of if they can afford to pay their bill or not and stay connected, right? So these long construction timelines, inevitable delays that we see really often in projects can be really harmful to those families that are hoping and waiting for those bill savings. And I think that the challenge is that, we would like to engage with them later in the process so they can, they spend less time waiting, but this is at odds with financiers that want to see really early upfront demonstration of interest and subscribers. So I think that we're trying to change that narrative and point out that there's no lack of interest. And we have hundreds of thousands of low-income customers in the state here that could really benefit from these savings. And let's push back on those requirements to enroll them so early in the timeline when we know that there can be so many delays to a project.
There's a lot of competing interests between we want to assess demand and understand where to site and build projects and talk to and engage with communities. We need to get in this interconnection queue and we need to sort of do the regulatory piece and get our building permits and such. I think from a policy perspective, one thing of interest is ways that we can streamline these processes, the required reports and things that need to be done, and just the timeline itself, right? So that we can get in there faster and build projects. And I don't really have too much of a fruitful comment about pointedly how to do that, but I agree, Warren, that this is like a major challenge when projects get delayed for 2 or 3 years.
Just wanted to add to Summer's point on trust. The longer, especially low to moderate income families or frontline communities are waiting for a project to be active and to actually see the benefit, the more hesitant they will be about the project. They'll start thinking, like you said, it's a bait and switch. This is a scam. I signed up. It's been 6 months. It's been 10 months. And the problem with that is they'll start talking. They'll start talking to their neighbors. They'll start talking to their friends and families, telling them to avoid these projects because it's all a scam. Nothing really happens. So it's a very fine line, like I said, where you have all the financiers that want to see the interest, that want to see those subscribers before they go ahead and give it the green light. And how long do we sign people up in advance so that there's that, you have to set expectations, but you also have to build that trust. And it's hard to build, but it's very easy to break. And once it's gone, you're never going to get it back. So you have to find that line between how do I show that there's interest, but also how do I protect the community so they don't think I'm taking advantage of them.
There are a couple of questions having to do with education and outreach. One is what sorts of advice any of you have about the best ways to do education and outreach within LMI communities to make sure people are well informed and know what they need to know to make a wise decision, and whether you have any suggestions for how community groups and community volunteers can get funding for doing community education around those sorts of issues.
Our organization uses an approach of using partner agencies across the state, and it's an infrastructure we already had established for our bill payment assistance programs and other programs. But basically, we're working with partners throughout the state in every county and every community who are other nonprofit organizations, and they may be energy related or not. So they could just be a local food bank, a local church, any sort of place where community members are already going to get resources that they might need. And we found that by training these partners to be able to provide education and outreach on our behalf around community solar, they can partner that, when households are already applying for other forms of assistance and streamline that process. So that's one way we found to get the word out there through those local partners. And what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
Funding for those sorts of activities.
I think you're right that there definitely needs to be more funding in this area, and it's not in my state, but I think I've seen in New Mexico and Illinois perhaps that there are funding opportunities for local organizations to do the education on community solar. So I think we should see more of that. Would be great.
Good. Well, what I'm going to do, we have 10 minutes left, and I'm going to ask one more question, and then after that, I'm going to give each person on the panel 1 minute to say anything you wish you had a chance to say that you haven't been able to say before, or to re-emphasize something you've said already to make sure people remember it on their way out the door. But my one question first was, a few people asked, are the results of your survey and your analysis published yet, or is this the first time it's out there in public form?
So we presented at the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference in DC in November, and we're currently working on a manuscript, which we hope we can publish in a journal. We're also working on smaller pieces like articles to submit to clean energy news outlets, and then finally the last place and best place to go is our Energy Allies website.
Great. So 7 people, you each get a minute. Who would like to go first with, famous last words for the audience here? Either something you haven't had a chance to say or something you want to reemphasize. And maybe we should start with the 2 folks who presented on the analysis. Jake, do you want to go first?
Sure. Famous last words. I think, just a reiteration that there was a shocking lack of research in this area. It's a relatively nascent field, but it was truly it was rather surprising. So a call to arms to all researchers out there that this is an area that there's just not that much evidence that we can support with empirical results. Something as simple as, does the 25-year hypothetical contract induce sign-up rates less than a 1 year? That this is the first time this results have been kind of put to the test. So there needs to be a lot more research that, of course, will support the best practices, and looking forward to kind of putting together those results to push together this really important field.
Great. And Zachary?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I want to emphasize that community-led solar is really important, and centering climate impacted voices are really important. But in order to really reach these goals that we've set for reaching like net zero carbon, we need all players. That includes developers and financiers, and that includes everybody working on clean energy. And so both sides are really, really important, of course, with a focus on centering those climate impacted communities first. Additionally, I just wanted to note that we have a lot of cool people working on community solar, but sometimes we're all working in different spaces, and I think more opportunities to come together is really important and really great, and allows for more learnings and collaboration, and we should definitely continue fostering that. So thank you all for joining in.
Great. So we'll now go to the other panelists, and I'm going to ask people in the order they appear on my screen. And Yesenia, you need to know you'll get the last word. Daniel.
Yeah, famous last words. I think communities often have more will, more drive, more patience, and more capacity, and are more organized than you think. And so, either helping them develop a project, or partnering with them to develop a project, or working with them to develop any kind of community solar project is really crucial. And then finding the right people on the ground and finding the right organization on the ground can really help accelerate in making sure that the project is accountable and the project is transparent and the project is actually truly successful in the long term.
Hey, great. Gilbert.
Yeah, last remarks for me, kind of piggybacking off of Daniel is, and it's cliche, but get involved. Demand and passion is a powerful thing. You want to see a project in your community, even if you don't have state level enabling legislation, talk to your cooperative, talk to other folks. There's ways that you can still deploy projects and have those conversations and sort of push for better policy. And one last thing that we haven't talked about a ton is in terms of getting involved is the NCSP, the National Community Solar Partnership at the federal level. Super important tool. It's a great way if there's local officials on the call to engage with other local officials and communities that are doing projects. They offer technical assistance. It's just a really great tool to learn about how you can build projects in your community.
Thank you, Gilbert. Well, Summer's next, and then it'll be Kim, and then Yesenia.
Thanks, Warren. I'll just end with saying that community-led solar is a really amazing opportunity to realize a just transition, and that in order to really do that, the value of justice and the value of community ownership needs to be reflected in all stakeholders. So state policy, city policy, the public utilities, and that there needs to be an agreed upon core beliefs and narrative that community-owned solar has intrinsic value that centers justice, and that needs to appear in how incentives are set, how investments are moved, and in how processes are reviewed and resources are shared. And so in kind of all pieces of the puzzle need to come together, and that's what what is meant when we say it's all hands on deck moment, and that's not going to take one industry or one person to make this change. It's not going to happen overnight. So, this can happen with just reaching out to your local elected official and telling them that community-owned clean energy, solar, wind, energy source, this is important to you, and that you're going to use your voice, in whatever social or community setting and voting ability to reflect that value. And I think that coming together on the shared narrative of what valuing equity looks like is going to be the big wave of systemic change we need.
Thank you, Summer. And Kim.
Yeah, I think Summer really took mine, but also I'll just repeat the message that every single person really plays a role. If we're going to achieve an equitable and just clean energy transition, it's up to every person, no matter where you are or what you do for work or where you live. So I just encourage everyone to speak up. If you see injustice, inequities, demand better of yourself and of those around you.
Thank you. And Yesenia, you get the last word here.
Community involvement can't be a checklist, and it cannot be an afterthought. The earlier we involve a community in the process, the better it's going to be for everyone, especially for the community, since they'll be reaping the benefits. But again, we have to start with the community. It has to be centered around the communities, whether they own the projects or they partner with a for-profit developer to create the project. They have to be involved from the very beginning of the process in order for a community to actually realize any benefits. And if you're a state or a city that's looking into your regulations or your laws, do also start with the community and see where the community's at and what they need before you start designing your regulations and your laws.
Hey, everybody on the call, on the panel, and the researchers, you collectively have an important perspective on this topic of community solar, and I really appreciate how articulate you've all been in presenting that and making such a strong case for centering the community in the lead role in community solar development. I hope everybody on the call who's listened in will go out and read more about the study that was done when it's published, and will try to take to heart the ideas that have been presented here today. So thank you all, and We encourage people to come back to more webinars from the Clean Energy States Alliance. You can see on the screen a couple coming up soon, including one on incorporating equity into offshore wind. So thanks all for coming today.